this discussion. So just a few notes on format before we get started. This session is the second session in our series of 4 sessions. You're welcome to come to all of the sessions, and you can use the same link to access each of the sessions, which will continue on Tuesdays at this time in August. But you're also welcome to join for just 1 or 2 sessions as your schedule or your interest allows. This discussion aims to explore the complex features of Jewish peoplehood and the contemporary challenges to Jewish unity. This will not be a political discussion about Israel, but a dialogue on what it means to be a member of the Jewish people, some of the core values that animate Jewish peoplehood, and the ways that our relationship to Israel is bolstered or hindered by those values. We will alternate between who in the group is the primary facilitator, but this will be structured as a dialogue among the 4 of us. So in a sense, we're inviting all of you to eavesdrop in on what will be an intimate discussion. And as such, we've all agreed to speak to one another as we would in private, including using first names. We are, of course, aware, though, that you're all here, and we are really interested in what you have to say as well. And so we welcome you to participate using the Q&A feature or the chat feature that you have available on Zoom. And we'll be peering into the chat or the Q&A at various points throughout the time. And for me, who's facilitating, if I get lost in it, I know the other 3 will help me out with that. We'll try to incorporate all your comments as best we can. If you are watching this on Facebook or on YouTube, you're welcome to either join us on Zoom or to submit questions. You can get the Zoom link, or you can submit questions to Randy Smith at Central Reform Congregation, which we're grateful for her help. Her email is Randy with an I, Smith at centralreform.org. And Randy can also help with any technology issues that you might be having. A quick word just to say we're grateful to all the institutions that have supported us and allowed us to come together in this space. Congregation Sheremet, Central Reform Congregation, Congregation B'nai Emunah, the Jewish Community Relations Council, where all of us are employed. We're also grateful to the Jewish Federation Shema Listen series for co-sponsoring this program. And most of all, we're grateful to the Shalom Hartman Institute, where each of us have had the privilege to be fellows, which has provided each of us with the learning to ground these discussions and the space to be challenged by all of these questions. So with that, let's get started. So it's so great to be with all of you again. I feel like a talk show host, like I have to kind of welcome you to my stage. But you know, as we were talking through all of the different topics, I really jumped into this topic that we're calling Universalism and Particularism. I think in part because I feel so compelled by and so obligated by this question. So I first of all want to just say, I want to give some credit where credit is due, that a lot of these thoughts come through Dr. Alana Stein-Hain at the Hartman Institute. So I want to say that at the beginning, because I think at this point I can't really separate my own thoughts from hers. And so we'll just acknowledge her in all of this. She's a wonderful scholar based in New York. But, you know, for me, I think, right, so there's this tension that seems to exist, or we talk about kind of this spectrum, where on one end we have particularism, this idea that we have to only be deeply focused in our own community. And I think particularly it comes up for the Jewish community, right? We have to work exclusively for the Jewish community. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have this idea of universalism, right? That we need to care about the entire world. And we often seem to be in tension between these 2 ideas. I know that I often get, probably on a weekly basis, I'll get a few angry emails from people, usually critical of something that we're doing at the JCRC. And very often people will say to me, they'll say, don't forget that the J of JCRC stands for Jewish. And what they mean when they say that to me is, you're not working enough for the Jewish community. And I'm always really thrown by that, because for me, like the J of JCRC, of what does it mean to be Jewish, is very much like, what does it mean to advocate for human rights throughout St. Louis, or to speak about racial equity right now during this time, or in the economy at this time of COVID. And so I'm actually, in some ways, it's really hard for me to have that conversation, because it's such a, I feel like we're talking different languages in it. And I'm curious if those are, if how all of you, I mean, so what happens when we work, particularly, all of us are employed by the Jewish community, but just knowing all of you, you also, you know, we all kind of venture out of the Jewish community. How do you all see some of that balance in terms of the work that you do, of what's in and what's out?
I'm happy to jump in here, Rory, and thank you for that really beautiful introduction. You just summed up one of the great challenges of my personal life as well as my entire career as a rabbi. I have always, as long as I can remember, always resisted the pull of Jewish particularism in favor of the pull of universalism. I've always felt myself much more compelled by my role as a member of a particular people or community or faith or nation or any of those things as only valuable insofar as it challenges me to see myself as part of a whole universal world. And I remember being, just as a kid, just astounded when I learned Rabbi Hillel's famous words, because so many people, I think, in our community sometimes read Rabbi Hillel's teaching as "Imein ani li," and they stop there. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And that, as if that was sufficient. And I still remember the very earliest memories of learning that teaching and saying, no, he didn't only say that. He said, and if I am only for myself, what am I? And for me, the only reason to be committed to the particular is if it turns me around and points me towards the universal. I'll stop there for now. I could go on a lot. This is like you, this is a topic that animates me tremendously, and particularly in the realm of this conversation about Israel and Zionism.
Thank you, Jim. That was really beautiful too. But Daniel, go ahead.
No, please.
So thank you. Those beautiful introductions and beautiful initial comments. I actually want to start in an interesting place for me. I was thinking a lot about this in the context of Rabbi Lipnick of blessed memory, who was the rabbi of Bnei Emunah for 58 years. That's an awfully long time. And Rabbi Lipnick told me that we don't work for Congregation Bnei Emunah, we work for God, Torah, and Israel. And in and of itself, of course, that is a kind of a particularist orientation to the world. And I remember when we first started to have the conversations about changing our logo and changing our slogan and our mission statement, we ultimately arrived at what we have today, which is in the midst of being reimagined, which is where Jews and Judaism connect, right? So Bnei Emunah, where Jews and Judaism connect. And then, of course, people have started to come to me and say, well, wait a second. What about other people who are interested in Judaism and the great wisdom of what Judaism has to say? Like, you're kind of leaving people out. It's not part of your core mission. So I might not be quite where Jim is on the universalist scale. I think I find myself a little bit more pulled towards the particularist. I do work for an institution with a kind of vision. I just think that the institutional vision has to grow and mission has to change. And as it changes, I'm being impacted as well. So trying to figure out how to say where Jews and Judaism and people interested in Judaism and people who might someday be interested in Judaism might connect, or maybe just where people connect, or just Bnei Emunah connect, something that might work, something zingy. But I'm really struggling with all of this. And I too very much have heard over the course of time that it is our responsibility and obligation, maybe even in a more particularist way, that your job is to work with your members, right? The people who pay dues, not necessarily the people who are interested. And so I think this notion of universalism and particularism plays out in many different ways. But for me, that's one of the ways, as a rabbi of a particular institution, how we're working this through. And I'm excited by this dialogue because I already grew just in the few moments that I've heard my colleagues speak, and I can't wait to hear what Daniel's going to say next and edify us.
So first, Carney, I love your the slogan for Bnei Emunah, where Jews and Judaism meet. And the first time I saw it on a water bottle, I took a picture and sent it right to a friend, a Christian colleague who was. We have a gentle, friendly, ongoing debate as to whether being Jewish and observing Judaism have necessary overlap with each other. So your slogan was very helpful with me for me. I appreciate that. Yeah, I grew up always being the most particularistic person in my space. I was always felt drawn to things that were Jewish and to being around folks that were Jewish and to being in Jewish spaces. and to working for the Jewish people, right? I mean, at some level, we all have that, I guess, if we end up as rabbis, maharats. And that was true in HUC when I was probably sort of the most particularist in my class. It was true in Peoria. It was true when I went to Cincinnati. And then something in me collapsed. Jim is smiling, I think, because he was kind of there for the collapse. When the election of Donald Trump and finishing Hartman for me and taking the wrong job in a very particularist institution, a large suburban, wonderful community, but suburban conservative congregation in Cincinnati. And somehow the whole idea that I had in my head, this whole way of building out how everything that I was doing when I was teaching a kid to chant via Hafta and rap tefillin, that like somehow it was making the world better, like it all came collapsing down on me, in a more particular kind of way. I had all sorts of reasons that I would give for, years and years ago for not officiating in an interfaith wedding, or why someone who wasn't Jewish, who was the non-Jewish parent of a bat mitzvah, couldn't come up and stand there with the other parent during the aliyah, or what. I had all of these very particular things that used to really bother me. And I find today, I work at a shul. It's the only shul, CRC, I'm quite proud of this today. It's the only shul I know of that you don't have to be Jewish to belong. And anyone can belong to CRC as long as you sign on to our core values. But you don't actually have to be Jewish to belong. And all of these things that I found that used to particularly bother me, I discovered that just the universal feels so much more important. Which isn't to say that I don't feel a sense of loss. I actually feel a deep sense of loss of the particular. And I feel like I'm trying to rebuild what it is that means and my own personal Jewish observances and these sorts of things. But those are my reflections.
I really appreciate all of you sharing. And it's giving me opportunity to reflect, because I think for me, a lot of the question, I don't know if question is even the right word, but I grew up in such a particular context that for me, sort of when I think about looking towards the universal, I don't think of it as leaving the particular behind, because I think I feel so grounded in the particular, which I think is something that might be interesting for me as a transplant into St. Louis, kind of without all of that history here, and then coming in first to Base Abe and then to the JCRC, where so much of what we do is bringing the Jewish community into a broader context. But I think back to my own childhood, where I went to, I was only ever in Jewish day school, Jewish summer camps. I mean, the neighborhoods we lived in were so overwhelmingly Jewish. I used to joke about it. I almost wish we had done kind of an ethnography of the neighborhood in Brooklyn where I'd lived. Like, I remember there was a point where the main street that, where we would walk to the subway station, at one point a Subway restaurant opened, and they put up a big sign in the window, like in Subway colors and Subway font, that said, "This is not," underlined, "a kosher Subway." Like, the default was people assume, like, it was a Subway, like, who was, but like only in Brooklyn, like, would you assume that a Subway would be kosher? And they had to like tell you that it wasn't, right? Or like the 7-Eleven had a big sign in the window that said, "We have Chalav Yisrael milk," right? Like, this was the neighborhood I grew up in. And so it wasn't like I was particular necessarily by choice. Those were just the only people I really had a chance to interact. Like, that was the context. And frankly, even voting in local elections was voting kind of Jewish politics, because the neighborhood was so Jewish that it was Jewish causes that were really coming up. And so, for me, it's almost like a more recent thought process to even think about, just because like the universal in particular, there was no kind of universal in some ways where I was, because the broader context was such a Jewish context as well. But I still feel so very grounded. Like, I really appreciate, Daniel, what you're saying, because it's giving me pause. But I think I still do feel that very grounding in the particular, which is why when I look towards the universal, I feel like I'm coming at it so Jewishly that it doesn't feel universal to me.
So Rory, I should say that I really resonate with that now. And I hadn't thought of it this way, but I do think that I do think a big part of my change has been also sort of the sense of rabbinic self-confidence and authenticity that I took away from Hartman. I went into that with, all of the sort of inauthentic questions that I think all of us probably come into a lot of this with was early on in my rabbinic career. And I just don't feel that anymore. I feel as sort of authentically Jewish and authentically rabbinic as anyone else, or to say it differently, like I discovered all the other emperors are not wearing clothes either. So.
And to add to that, Daniel, I think that's really insightful. And Rory, I wanted to also comment on your story about sort of nature versus nurture almost. The way we are raised has not a necessary, but often an obvious impact on the values we cherish. So my childhood upbringing was not 100% polar opposite what you described, but quite a bit opposite. Although my parents were very, very devoted, practicing Reformed Jews, committed deeply, but we always lived where we were the only Jews. We didn't see a kosher restaurant or a kosher store or a kosher Subway. They didn't have Subways where I grew up, but we lived out in the country. We lived in rural areas. My parents, for whatever reasons, imbued us with this deep commitment to Judaism at home, but a deep commitment to that Judaism translating into being part of the greater society around us and impacting it without making a big deal about it. So bringing our values, whatever they were as Jewish values, into our lives as the only kids in our schools and the only kids in our scout troops and the only Jewish kids in our community and neighborhood, teaching others about what it meant to be Jewish without being consumed by it. And so it's interesting. It's an interesting psychological journey to think about how we've each developed in our own way. It's fascinating.
I wanted to throw two things into this conversation. One is just a quote that I remember from Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who used to call himself a generic practitioner of a particularist tradition. So wrap your head around that, right? A generic practitioner of a particularist tradition. Also, I'm getting a message that it's hard to hear me. I don't know if everybody can hear me now. I hope you can hear me. I think about that a lot because Reb Zalman was a very important figure in our lives and in our growing up, in a place where we were really in Yenemsveld. I mean, we were really in the diaspora. We were in Winnipeg, right? And being that kid who brought his own hot dog, right, to the birthday party kind of thing, that kind of reality. In fact, there's a book that one of our teachers wrote, a non-Jewish teacher, was our teacher. A book was called Jelly Beans Aren't Kosher. Right, the kid who couldn't have the jelly beans that the teacher was handing out for a wide variety of reasons. So this whole notion of being show kids, right, being the people who are demonstrating to the world at large, what does it mean to live a Jewish life? Now, as a kid, that took on a lot of food things, right, hot dogs and jelly beans. But what does it mean to be a symbolic exemplar of a tradition that isn't only about speaking to us? It's about forging us, but also being readily available as wisdom that could be shared with the world at large. And maybe, and I see this in somebody putting in the chat, at this notion of tikkun ha'olam, right? Tikkun olam, that we have a responsibility and an obligation to be engaged and involved in making the entire world better based on the wisdom which is ours, and not ours to hold close to our hearts or chests, but rather to share with the world at large.
So I appreciate all of that, and I feel Jim, with what you were saying also in terms of our upbringing, I feel like I should just acknowledge. I know last time, and I just saw Carney, your mom popped in with some comments. I heard from my mother afterwards that she enjoyed it, so we should just kind of acknowledge all of us who have our families listening, and all the ways that I always, every time my mom afterwards tells me she enjoyed something, I always go, oh, what did I say about them? So hi, Mom. So
maybe the two moms want to talk to each other. We can get off and they can have a great conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Which I think it's interesting to see. Like I see in my own family the ways in which like my parents also end up impacted. Because like my parents also always grew up in New York, and they grew up in a very specific context. And as I have ventured out, like I'm sort of like the most. I'm the most, I don't know, kind of out in the world. I have three brothers, most of whom study in Kollel. They're in, for those it's context, they're in Jerusalem and Lakewood, New Jersey, and the 5 towns in Long Island. And so, and here I am out in St. Louis. So, but that's also, I think, kind of changed my parents' perspective also, right? Which is something, I mean, this is a different discussion altogether, but like, it's something I think about a lot as I think about the ways that I raise my kids, right? Because like, I think we always sort of give them what it is that we've learned, but part of what I've learned is because of, this like deep upbringing that I've had that, and frankly, like I can't recreate that in St. Louis, what I had in New York. Right. But so I think we sort of, we sit in somewhat of like this tension then, of kind of like where we are, right, where all of us, I think, are sort of grappling with what it means, right, like where we bring the universal and where we bring the particular. And what I found really helpful, so Alana offers 3 ways of thinking about it that I want to share, and we can use those as ways to reflect, but I found them really helpful in terms of language to use. And so the 3, she doesn't talk about it as a universal versus a particularist. It's not a sense of like you're either one or the other, but the idea that actually everyone, like I think even the people who kind of see themselves at the furthest end of the spectrum, on some level, all of us, right? I think maybe with rare extreme exceptions, like all of us are in some ways interacting with the wider world. And those of us who choose opt into the Jewish community are in some ways kind of, investing ourselves in the Jewish world. And so it's not a question of, are you a universalist or a particularist, but how you find these two to coexist. And so she suggests that the first approach she offers is what she calls the balance approach. And in this, the balance approach she describes is basically seeing these as two, what I just said, right? Seeing them as at odds with one another. So it still recognizes that there's a contrast between them, and then trying to find some kind of golden mean between them. So essentially, this almost becomes like a resource allocation. Right. So if I'm going to spend some of my time doing a universalist cause, I need to spend some of my time doing a particularist cause. Right. And this is something I often feel this feels very almost like donor relations, right? It's very dollars. It's very, right? Like it's X amount of staff resources goes to this, X amount of staff resources goes to that. And ultimately, right, what's the right balance of those two that, too much of one makes you like not Jewish enough or whatever it is, right? I also feel like that sometimes with, we sort of know who are, who's going to be upset with one program. And so how do we create another program to kind of, right? So it's always about like this dance that we do, right? So that's this balance approach, right? You're laughing because we've all done it, right? Right. The second that she describes is what she calls the conditional approach, right? The conditional approach basically says like we aspire to a universalism in some ways, right? Maybe not like right, but like we would love to look towards something that is more universal, but we can only do that when we have first finished the particular. So first, we're going to make sure that the Jewish community is safe, is secure, is established in whatever way. And once we do that, then we can go and we can look elsewhere. I know this is oftentimes I hear this discourse very frequently when it comes to Israel as well, right? That right, we can't talk about what's happening. We can't talk about whatever it might be, occupation, or we can't talk about, right, until Israel first is safe and secure, that security needs to come first. And I'm not inherently criticizing that argument. I think security is an incredibly important piece of it. The tension that I sit with in it is, right, like what's the measure of that, right? At what point do we feel like, right, and I feel like this in my own life. Frankly, I feel it right now. I feel a deep sense of insecurity just in the context of the world we live in right now, right? So none of us know what's happening next in terms of COVID, and we're all really concerned about our families, about the economy, right? And so, right, but what is sort of enough money to have saved in the bank, right? Like what is the point where you sort of feel like now I'm good, and now I can go and help other people. And fortunately, our community has still been incredibly generous about it, right? But I feel like there's no kind of clear monetary amount of like, oh, you need to have 3 months worth of your food budget or rent or whatever it is, right? So there's that conditional approach. And then the third approach is this, what she calls the synthesis approach, right? The recognition, and I think it's resonating with some of the conversation that we're having here, that that the universal and the particular are actually deeply intertwined with one another, and that by doing the universal work, we're actually doing the particular work, and by doing the particular work, we're actually doing the universal work. And frankly, I see all three of them existing in our community. I find it really helpful for me because sometimes I find I might be leaning towards one and someone might be speaking from the other. But what I find interesting for myself in it is that while I think that there's times, and I think right now also, I feel this third one, the synthesized approach, very poignantly. I think certainly in my life, in my history, but I think even in my present, I think there's different times where I sort of jump in between all of those, right? I think there's times where I kind of feel like, okay, I want to be able to do this, but right now I need to take care of my own family. And once I feel okay with my family, then, I can go out and I can help with that. Or, there's times where I just kind of feel like, okay, I can give 2 hours to this and that's it because I have 5 hours for here, right? So I actually don't even think that they're necessarily completely different camps. I think I find myself in each of the three camps on various issues.
Hey, Rory, can I ask you a question in particular about Jewish education for a moment? I know it's not where you were going, but ask yourself the question, right? The particularist versus the universalist. Like, where would you want to put your kid at a particular moment in time in order to gain a particular kind of perspective so that they are then ready to walk in the world and feel confident about themselves, right? And I think that's an area that I hadn't thought about till you started to speak. And I wonder if the group here might reflect on that. At least I'd be really interested to hear what you as my teachers and colleagues have to say about that, right? Do we consciously make a determination to put our kids, let's say, in a day school, in a yeshiva, in a particular kind of environment for a particular period of time in order to incubate them so that they're then ready and prepared to face the world at large, and then maybe ultimately, quote unquote, grow into the notion of universalism, but secure in who they are before they walk out. So that's the question I want to throw out. I just want to just also allude to something I put in the chat. Like, isn't this a great moment in time? Here we are in postmodern America, being able to have the conversation about a choice between being a particularist and a universalist or somewhere on the spectrum. There were generations of our people who could not have that choice. And so I just want to say sort of like, Baruch Hashem, like we are in a blessed moment in time to be able to have this discussion, this debate, and to be able to share it with hundreds of people. I just think it's such a bracha. And I just want to acknowledge that for a moment because I'm sure that my great Zayda probably didn't have the opportunity to have this conversation, even if he had Hurim about wanting to have this conversation, he couldn't even have it. So anyhow, just back to the question. Thanks.
You might even call it a standing at Sinai kind of moment, Carney.
Maybe that was what a great wow. Again, standing at Sinai again.
Yeah, no, I do. I want to take a moment just to sit with your last point though, because I do think I think I jumped right into this conversation without kind of deeply appreciating just what that means. And I think about it just in various points in my own life where, I remember taking a trip to Poland where my grandfather's from and asking my father and my aunt, like, what would he think about, sort of choosing to go back to Poland for a visit. And I had like some kind of sense of like deep connection of sort of this history. And I remember my aunt just going like, he would have hated it. Like he would have hated that you were going back, and but just this idea of like all that those who came before us have done to get to this moment where we can even have the luxury of this conversation, and that is a deep blessing. So thank you for making us pause to appreciate that.
I'm struck that, particularly coming from sort of the progressive world, I think we often actually think of these things in a hierarchy where universalism is seen as a more morally superior place to be. I didn't mean it in exactly those words that I just said, but right. I think there is something there. But I'm really struck that the real contemporary critiques of wokeness, right? Sort of, and I mean that in the broadest sense there, not disparagingly, whether we're talking about intersectionality or more, really remind us that it is impossible to do anything universal except from our particular perspective, right? Like, as I understand it, this is the critique of intersectionality, that I will always be sitting here with stacked identities. I will always be a cis, white, Jewish man, and all of those things intersect and sort of create something different because of that, which is to say that, like, I think it's impossible, as much as we imagine that we transcend the particular to, you know, get to the universal, that I don't think that's possible anymore. And I think that's the lesson, right? Like, that's the whole lesson of when you say that you're colorblind, oh, I don't see race, that propagates and promulgates racism in our world, even if we don't mean it to, right? You can't ever abandon the particular.
Jim, you look like you were about to jump in.
First of all, yes, and yes, and yes. I was still thinking back on Carney's first question about how we educate our children and how tangible that also is. But then both Carney's comment about Jewish privilege and your comment, Daniel, about color blindness as a metaphor really moved me, because all of that resonates and adds this challenge. As far as educating children, I don't know if we want to go down this path, because I know, Rory, you have a plan, or at least had a plan for today. I'm not sure whether you still do. But I couldn't help but sharing that, just reflecting briefly on that, because it's so metaphoric and symbolic. Having personally been a product of a public education system where, as I said earlier, I was the only Jewish child, not only in my grade, but often in my school, except for my siblings. When my wife and I had our own decisions to make about education, there was almost zero possibility that we would not choose a public, universalistic, what we believed was the broadest possible secular education for our children, knowing, first of all, that our children were growing up in a house where their father was a rabbi and we were deeply immersed in Jewish life no matter what, but also because we believed, and I want to nod to Daniel's comment, we believed somehow that a universalist secular education was somehow morally superior. And we actually rejected opportunities where we were living to put our children into a Jewish parochial school, into a day school, because we didn't want our children to be raised in a particularist all day long, every day educational system. And it was ironic that when we moved back to St. Louis, our youngest daughter was entering first grade, and we really struggled. At the time, we made a choice, and it was one of the best choices we ever made, was to put our third child into a Reformed Jewish day school, which has evolved into the Merowitz Community School. And we believe deeply that it is possible to educate children both for particularism and for universalism, that these two are handmaidens, that they walk together. And I think that ultimately may be where we're all headed here. So I don't know whether we want to spend time going down that question more, but not, but I had to reflect on
that. I'm thinking also, Carney, about because right, it's tachlis with us, particularly in synagogue life, when it comes down to educating kids. And there's this idea that we've been tossing around, just a handful of us at CRC. We have this program called Menschmakers that we do once a month, where it's like little kids and their adults doing community, social justice, social action kind of stuff. But we've been tossing around, what would it mean if we threw out, and for CRC folks watching, this is really like highly theoretical, don't get too concerned here, but what would it mean if we threw out for a moment everything that we do that we call religious school, and instead we focused just on this idea of making mensches, right? Like if we only thought of everything else, all the other pieces from B'nai Mitzvah to confirmation to whatever, as being in service to creating mensches, how would that change everything we do? Would we still spend 50% of our hours between the ages of 8 and 13 teaching kids a particular skill of reading Torah with trope from a scroll, right? Like, it changes everything, I think, and it's the core of this question. But right, do kids still know what Talmud is at the end of that? I don't know. And is that important if they're really good people? I don't know.
Which again resonates for me, at least with Reb Zalman's, right? Generic practitioners of a particularist tradition. The agenda is to get us big and broad. right? How you get there is a different story. How you prepare people to be big and broad, right? What's their mooring? What's their anchoring?
Well, I can't help but think of the teachings of the Talmud. I think, isn't it Shabbat, where the rabbis list all these secular universalist goals, like feeding hungry people, and healing the sick, and freeing the captives, et cetera, and they end up by saying the study of Torah is equal to them all, but not because study of Torah for its own sake is necessary, but because it leads to them all, right? That, that all these Jewish particularistic things that we believe are so important are important. They are important because they lead us to do this work of tikkun olam, as people are discussing in the chat, perfecting the world, fixing. And that's not a particularistic task. That's a universal task. It's not just about us.
And it's what God does, right? Yeah. We feed the hungry because God feeds the hungry. We clothe the naked because God, right? This is ultimately our acting out, imitatio Dei, right? Imitating the divine and bringing that into the world and being the agents of divinity in the world. What could be more universalistic than that?
But then we can't, if that is true, then we can't ever say, well, I'm only going to worry about my people. I'm only going to worry about Jews. Hungry Jews are what's important, or sick Jews are what's important. We can't say that ever. And when we do, I think we betray the core essence of this value that we're talking about.
So this is, I think, in many ways, you're all highlighting, I think, like a lot of my own journey that was like, I was so deeply immersed in all of these teachings that I didn't understand how, right? Like, of course, right? All of it is like, this is what God does. God visits the sick, and God gives clothes to the needy, and all of that. And I'm struck within it. It's a really unique, trying to look at the chat and all of you and remember where I'm going with this is like a unique skill set that I have to give you a lot of credit, Daniel, for how seamlessly you did it last week. So I just want to pause and name that. Because there's actually like a bunch of really interesting conversations that are happening simultaneously that I really want to lift up in all of this. Because first of all, I think 2 points in particular. One is that I really I think in this conversation want to challenge, I think what Alana Stein-Hain, it kind of calls us to challenge, and I think what we're also trying to do is it's not about then this debate between universalism and particularism, but it's really, like a what are we prioritizing in the moment, or what approach are we prioritizing in the moment, right? So I think like even at times, what I was saying before, right, there's certainly times where I feel incredibly called to whatever it is that might be happening that we'll call more universal in whatever context it is, but then, right, I have a sick child, or I have, somebody who's right. And that of course is going to take priority. And I don't want to just say that as a given, right? Because that's a particular, right? What does it mean, right? My child, right? So, we can talk about the poverty level of St. Louis as a whole. We could talk about crime within St. Louis as a whole. What does it mean for me to prioritize my child in this moment when other children could be sick or dying, right? But that is a sense of, right, first I can only go out and help others if I'm first okay, or if my family is first okay, in some fashion. Right. And so I think sorry, did you want to jump in?
No, that doesn't change the aspiration though, right? In other words, even when you're in the midst of caring for your own, it doesn't change the aspiration, ultimately to make this, heaven on earth, that this is our job. Yeah, so I don't think when you're concerned about your own child, which you described so beautifully, Roy, right? You've stopped thinking about the fact that there are other children out there who need you as well. It's just that this moment in time demands my attention on this particular orientation. And just to maybe push this envelope a little bit, right? In the midst of this time of pandemic, I thank God for the Jewish family services that exist right now that are providing food for everybody who needs it. But in this moment in time, the people who are calling me and calling our shul tend to overwhelmingly be Jews who are in need of help. Now, if a non-Jew calls and wants our help, we're going to help them as well. But at least at this moment in time, when the people in my own community, B'nai Ircha Kodim, the people of our own town, our own community, are first and foremost, I thank God that it's available. And it doesn't mean I've stopped caring about the world that's out there. It's just at this moment in time, I've got a limited amount of resource that I can use. And resource can be literally resources, can be money, but also time, energy. And
But
where do I
Carney-
want to use it? Yeah.
Carney, you're right. I love that also, but the instinct, the human instinct so often takes us another direction. And using the pandemic, think back 4 or 5 months, the first thing that happened was people rushed out and grabbed every roll of toilet paper they could get and brought it home to stockpile for the most particularistic thing I can think of for ourselves. And rarely, if ever, did most people think about, wow, what about all those people who are not part of my house or my family or my neighborhood or my people or my faith community who are out there who I forgot about. And our instinct is particular at the worst times, at the most dangerous times. Our instincts are so often particular. So it's a slippery slope, as the philosophers say.
Yeah. I'm with you 100%. I think I'm so glad that voice, your voice, is coming through so strongly on this. I just want to make sure that I remind everybody that 3 times a day I say, V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, right? That this is a God who's concerned about all humanity. And if I don't hear that every day when I'm davening, I might as well not daven, because it's not impacting my life. Okay. But when push comes to shove in the midst of the day, when the 10 calls are coming in and 9 of them are from the members of my congregation who need me at this moment in time, I'm okay with, for the moment, setting aside my universalism only for a moment to deal with the needs of the particular, and knowing that my aspiration is to change everything, but at least I'm going to work on my little corner for a moment in time.
Amen.
So yes to all of it, which, okay, I need to step back for just a minute, because there's 2 things I'm kind of noticing that I want to get a little bit meta for just a minute. One is I'm seeing a bit of a dialogue, and I know I just want to also name the fact there's some confusion in the chat, because some people are chatting things to everyone and some people are chatting things just to us and then responses. So I just need to kind of acknowledge that, and whatever you're sending is fine. But if there's confusion about what we're talking about, it's because we might be seeing different things. But first of all, I think there's been some pushback with some of this, and we're seeing some of it also in terms of if the 4 of us, right, if we have differences of opinion on things, and we'll see, because as we go, I'm sure some of it will become a little bit more highlighted. But I want to also say, I actually don't think, having spent time with all 4 of you and kind of knowing where we all sit, I think what we're all kind of experiencing is not 4 people who are in agreement, but 4 people who are incredibly respectful of each other and who are open to really learning. I think that a lot of our opinions are actually being formed in this discussion. We have not prepped this in advance. We have not had these conversations before. And so while there certainly are places where we do overlap, I don't want you to, when we say yes, and it's not because we're saying we're in complete agreement. It's because we're saying we understand what you're saying, and we appreciate the opinion that you're sharing, even as, and we want to then build upon it, because that's the style, I think, of study that we all deeply engage in. I think that's the beauty of the Beit Midrash to me is that sort of yes and, even and I think what I love about Talmud study, for those who have had the chance to do it, is that it's a yes and to even the most absurd of claims, right? So it's well, what if a ghost comes in and forces you to eat the matzah? And it's yes, but here's what that would still be an important example, right? It's no one's you idiot, that doesn't happen. It's yes, good point. And so I think that's, so I want to first really lift that up, that we actually all come from very different places and very different contexts. And so I think don't confuse respectful dialogue with just complete agreement with each other.
I think about it like sharpening my axe, right? We are sharpening our arguments and our orientations, also being open to the possibility of refining them. So I really find that the dialogue helps me rethink, reconsider, and be ready for iteration 2, 3, whatever it's going to
be. Exactly. Yeah. Right. So that's one piece of what I wanted to highlight. The other piece is actually something that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, that I think has been kind of coming up in some of this, which is that some people who have been kind of mentioning, even in some of the comments or questions, who are actually putting the 4 of us into different places on the spectrum. And I think that's actually what I really want to push back against. But I'm also I want to push back because I, I'm thinking about this also, first of all, because I think I'm having some reaction to where I'm being placed, because I don't think I agree with it, right? So I want to like name that, right? I think a lot of us oftentimes are, people kind of assume our place in various things because of, maybe what they see us do or because of parts of our conversation. I find that I often end up spending more time talking about the universal, partially because of the job that I have, and partially also what I said before, I feel so deeply entrenched in the particular that I don't feel the need to defend that, right? Like right, and I think it's interesting because I'm getting placed on a more universal end of the spectrum than some other panelists here, and yet, like, when I think about it in the context, right, like I've chosen to buy a house in a place where I can live amongst people who are all walking to the same synagogue. Where do I go to make sure that I have access? As we were looking for places to move, the questions that we're asking include things like the Jewish day school, having a mikvah, having, the supermarkets and kosher food, right? Various things, right? And so I feel like I said, right, like deeply grounded in the particular, which is why oftentimes I don't necessarily feel the need to talk about it in the same sort of way. And so I just want to really lift that up, though, in terms of like just to kind of name for those who are listening that I think I want to highlight just what is being said also in that I think we're all talking about where we're coming from right now, but also in that we kind of carry all of this baggage as well of where we've come from and these different contexts. And so what we might feel pulled to might be different, right? And I think this is also true. And this is actually where I think, Carney, your point before is also incredibly important. Because I also think it's very much about the context in which we sit at the moment. And so, I think that oftentimes, like at times, and this is maybe in some ways the conditional approach, where when I have felt really comfortable with where I am, then I can talk more universal. But then, certainly I also had times, and I would say even for myself, right, in moments of the pandemic where all of a sudden there was just this kind of total fear of the unknown. And I'll admit openly, like, I've just had certain nights where it just feels like everything is just overwhelming. And you have to kind of stop and take stock. And I have found great comfort in saying, here are all the Jewish institutional structures that we have in place, right? Here are all the safety nets, the social safety nets that we've created, right? Like I need to kind of remind myself, right? And how grateful I am to be so deeply entrenched in a particular society, even as I also do care deeply, right, but I feel like there's kind of just right, and so I realized when I haven't had that, when I haven't always stopped to say to myself, oh, here's who I can call upon if I need, it's because I realized that I haven't been living with that sense of fear for myself, right? And so what are the different, it's the context that we come from, it's where we're sitting now, and it's also the broader context of the world that surrounds us in terms of I think kind of what could be pulling us, which is why I say I think we can change it at different moments.
Rory, I really like that, this notion of the particular, I hadn't thought of it this way, being in some ways a safety net for us to fall back on, right? You can clearly see it in the way that some people think about and talk about Israel too. But I'm quite struck by that, because all of these things that the Jewish community is doing for the Jewish community in this moment of COVID, at one level, I think can be seen as, right, like how amazing that we are doing this. And at another level is a terrible indictment of our American society that we are not doing this collectively and universally, right? And in that sense too, the fact that there is such a thing as a Jewish food bank should be shameful in a certain sense, right? We shouldn't live in a country that needs food banks. That isn't providing this for everyone. It's an indictment, and so the particular position becomes a fallback for us to be protected. But I also wonder, how does that protection also come at the expense of others?
I want to say that I understand exactly where you're coming from. I appreciate what you're saying and the earnestness. I just want to make sure to remind everybody, right, that change is incremental. It's Chevle Mashiach. These are the vicissitudes that we go through in our quest for a utopian era. And so, yeah, would it be wonderful someday that we don't need food banks, right? And by the way, along the way, maybe we don't need Jewish food banks, right? But right now we do. And by the way, we don't need the Jewish
Oh,
food banks
yeah.
only for the distribution of food. We need to know as Jews that we've created food banks that are available to anybody who needs the food, because otherwise we're not living up to our own God-given mission or our own sense of who we are as a people doing God's work in the world. I know Rabbi Bennett is eager to.
No, I
Yeah,
agreed,
yeah.
Connie, agreed. And yet I think we also have to honor and respect and acknowledge that when Jewish food banks are created, there are debates amongst the founders of them to debate whether the food should only go to Jews or whether the food should be available to anybody. Thank God that most food banks resolve that towards the universal. But the very fact that the impulse is to say, you know what, we were hungry for a long time, we had to take care of ourselves, so we're going to set up a Jewish food pantry that's only for Jews. They got it. Everybody else has their own food pantries. The fact that that conversation takes place, and to Daniel's point, you know, the issues of Israel and Zionism about a safe haven for the Jews, what exclusive of a safe haven for the Jews that acts ethically and morally and justly towards every single human being, as the founders of that nation promised in the Declaration of Independence, and as the vision of that nation has always believed is the goal. And nonetheless, we digress and we snap back to the particular. I think we just have to honor that or acknowledge that. I don't think we should honor it. I think we should fight against it. So I agree with you. You're right. And as Rory said, yes, and.
And I think,
Jim,
you know,
I wonder whether, because I love what you're saying and sort of talking about how the story that we have told has changed, right, to this more particularist piece. But I also wonder if it's not that we're seeing that the stories that we told ourselves are not the stories that are shared by everyone else also, right? I know that that's a lesson I've learned when it comes to my relationship with Israel and my relationship to America and my relationship to thinking that racism is a problem and right, like lots of these things that I understood to be universally shared language, I now understand to be quite particular.
By the way, there was an interesting comment from somebody in the chat. We're all trying to follow it all at once and each other. But one of the comments was, and I think it's important to acknowledge, that our Jewish food pantry is the only one that really offers a kosher food option, right? And that I think is an important part of this conversation as well, that I don't expect non-Jewish food pantries to have options, and maybe within the options, several options, right? We mentioned Chalav Yisrael before, but somebody who needs Chalav Yisrael could get it through our community. Somebody who needs, Chabad Shchita can get, right, kosher slaughter can get it because our community has to worry about the particulars of the particulars, and only individual communities can do that. I would not expect that from a general food bank, and so maybe that's the niche. The niche is when we can deal with the specific needs of our community, which only any individual ethnic community really understands for itself, just to become woke to that notion, right, Daniel? That if we woke to the notions and the nuances of what individualized, atomized groups within a group sometimes need, is, I think, our part in this conversation as well.
And I think, I mean, that comes back to me to the Hillel quote, right? That's the, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I, right? I think that's the push, right? Like 100%, I think we do need Jewish food pantries for exactly that reason. Food pantries don't always, they don't know how to, I don't expect to, right? I mean, the nuances of the laws of kashrut and then the different kind of subgroups within it. And so what does it mean to, it's not just no bacon and separate milk and meat, but then Chalav Yisrael, or what kind of situations or whatever it might be, right? Of course, we're going to need to take care of our own community, but if that's the only thing we do, then who do we become in the process, right? And I think, within this, I mean, I really want to highlight, because I think we're talking about this, like, there is this aspirational element of what does it mean to kind of view this world, this utopian world that we can be part of realizing. And at the same time, I feel I love the Jewish community, right? Like I so deeply I don't just mean that in terms of the people of the community, right? Like, I mean, I've said often, right, just how deeply immersed, like I love Torah study. I love the rich history, the arguing with God that we do, the the annual process of reflection. I know we're all kind of getting close to high holidays, and I don't want to start triggering those, right? But like there's so much deep wisdom, and I imagine this is probably true for many people, but I think that like many of us sort of get to a point in our lives where you sort of have to kind of pause and think like, is my way better than any other way, right? And I know for me, like that was a really profound journey that of sort of feeling like, do I have exclusive rights to wisdom, right? Like, what does it mean to have a God who would only give Torah to the Jews and give Torah to nobody else? And we're such a small percentage of the population that really kind of stacks the deck against most of humanity. Do we really believe all of that? And sort of feeling like other people have access to truth, but if so, then what's the point of my truth? And ultimately for me, like recognizing like, other people have their paths, but this one is mine, right? And it's so deeply connected to me. And so, and I think, and maybe this goes also to sort of what you were saying earlier, Daniel, like there's parts of us, you can't actually be a universalist, right? You can't be like a what is it? Like what's the word for like, not trans, but like right? You can't be like, we're not like a post-racial society. We're not a post-gender, like we're not, because we're all kind of deeply within it. And so I do feel really deeply like for me, my place of this is in the Jewish community. And so in that, because I also, and this was a question that came up, right? Like on the one hand, we could say, okay, so if the point is to feed the world, we could feed the world anyway. Why support the Jewish food pantry? I could support food pantries of anything, right? And I think for me, there is part of it is the recognition that this is the only food pantry that is going to serve some of the people in my community who need it. But for me, also, there's something really profound about what it is to do this work as a Jewish person. Again, because I don't see it as universal work, right? If I'm going to Jefferson City because I think that a bill is dangerous for everyone, right? It's my Judaism that compels me to do that. And I go as a Jew and through Jewish institutions because that is my grounding. But not because I feel like what I'm doing is then a universal cause. I feel like what I'm doing is so overwhelmingly Jewish.
But isn't from the very beginning what you just described, the mission of the Jewish people, the rituals that we were being asked to do, isn't one way to look at all of this history as training us for this task of making the entire world better? The Jewish people's mission from our very founding, from the beginning, from Avram, from the beginning of the peoplehood, was not about just us. It was about us as agents of change to create a world where all humanity and all the world enjoyed the outcome. So if we frame particularism as our unique path, our language of faith, our journey, and our journey is about everybody. It's not about us, but when we focus particularism in on ourselves, then we forget that the whole reason we're here is for everybody. Does that make sense? I don't know. To me, it does.
I mean, I think that's the, I have it pulled up. I was going to feel out kind of some of the time, right? But that's the quote, that's God's promise in Genesis, right? When God says to Abraham, right, go forth from your native land, from your father's house, the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you, right? That like deeply, I think, intertwined into our particular narrative, right? Like that's, I think, a quintessential example of where you have this like deeply particular of this chosenness of God of one person, but the recognition that that chosenness is supposed to inherently, right? Because if we're all universal, then we're all sort of amorphous, right? There's no foundation to stand on. And so inherent in having this deep grounding is what then is the impact, right? Like, what does it mean that Jews exist in the world, right? Not just for the sake of Jews, but, right, I think when we talk with pride about Jews surviving for so long and Jews I think like our pride is partially just this idea, it's this small nation that has faced so much adversity, but I think we also look and see all the ways that our Jewish community has impacted the world in such positive ways.
And I don't want to,
Go ahead, Carney.
I don't want to leave out the whole notion, right? Not to mix text and midrash here, okay? But remember, Avram Avinu breaks the idols, right? It's the iconoclastic element of who we are, that we have to break the structures that existed before us. And by the way, maybe this is an era where we have to break the structures that we have created for ourselves as interim structures that are needed for a particular moment in time, right? There was a moment in time, I saw this in the chat, I think it was Galia who said it, right? We needed a Jewish hospital. We needed a Jewish this and a Jewish that because there was nobody else to care for us. The question becomes, in this day and age, what are we going to need, or what do we need? What's the technology that we need that we can bring, that Jewish wisdom can bring to the world, so that we can be ready to face the next era? And I think when God calls to Avram Avinu, right, it's not just in a moment in time. This is a perpetual call, right? Like the voice of Sinai that's reverberating. It is the same call to us now. How are we going to be the blessing to all the nations of the world? How are we going to do that? How are we going to use what we've experienced till now and our traditions that we carry forward to now be the iconoclast in this era to create what it is that we need into the next? And if the pandemic has taught me anything, and I think us anything, right, we need to be far more creative than we've ever been in the past. This is going to propel us forward in uncomfortable ways. But I think we all know that often the greatest growth happens in those moments of discomfort. I get on my treadmill and I go for the same 20 minutes every day. I'm not going to make much progress. It's good, but it's not great. If we want to be great, we got to push ourselves beyond where we are right now.
I'm struck. I think there's a conversation that's happening underneath this also about whether or not there exists a reason to be Jewish. Right? Like, is there a reason that we should do Jewish or be Jewish or act Jewish? Like, I always think back to all of our teacher of blessed memory, Rabbi David Hartman, who I remember one of the last lessons I heard from him in person. Someone asked him that question, right? Like, why should we be Jewish? Why should we do Jewish? And there was this room full of like 250 rabbis who were waiting, thinking that David Hartman was about to give us the answer that we've been waiting for. And his answer has always stuck with me. He says, look, I eat tzimmus because I was raised eating tzimmus and I like eating tzimmus. If you don't like eating tzimmus, don't eat tzimmus. And it has really stuck with me that I don't believe, after spending a lot of energy and a lot of my sort of early professional life searching for the reason that everyone should be, right, like so that I can explain to everyone on the high holy days why now you should keep kosher and you should like all these things and your life will be better. And I'm not there at all anymore. I do Jewish and I live Jewishly because I don't know how to live in any way that's not this.
No, but it's interesting because you talked about tzimmus. I remember Hartman talking about it as Zeta, right? This is his Zeta. But there's a reason to live as your Zeta live that's beyond, I think, not to make it trite, because you heard tzimmus and I heard Zeta, right? For me, tzimmus feels different than Zeta, right? In other words, Zeta represents something that I'm carrying on that has great value, right? That has moral and ethical underpinnings that enabled people to live through the vicissitudes that they were experiencing in the most tumultuous of times. So when I live in a free and open society that allows me to, do it my way at the kosher Burger King, right? How could I potentially abandon that which was so profoundly important and sustaining and nourishing for a previous generation? I feel like letting it go wholesale is a chutzpah that I couldn't muster.
And I agree with you. I just don't, in my personal life and how I live right? I send my kids to Jewish day school. We love Merowitz. Yeah.
We love your kids, so it's good.
Yep.
I think I just want to be really explicit of what I hope has been implicit within this conversation, that I think so I wrestle with this conversation all the time because I think it informs everything that I do. And and even the tension of the question that we raised before, right? Because like then I also think, right, like why should people get involved through the JCRC when you can get involved in any other way, or why join a particular congregation, right? All of these for me is this balance in my life of this particular and the universal. But I think what also then drives it, and the reason why I wanted to bring it up particularly in our context, is because this has huge implications, right? And we spent the bulk of the time talking about this because this is where I think this is the underpinning of the conversation, right? But it starts to, I think, then manifest deeply in questions of Zionism and questions around Israel in terms of, I think in a way, maybe multifold. I don't know if I'm going to only say on two, right? One is, I think, the question of, right, so there's some people who then who get uncomfortable with Jewish nationalism, right? What does it mean? Do we need a particular Jewish state? And why do some of us feel the need to have a particular Jewish state? But then I think also, right, even in the recognition of having a particular Jewish state, what should the culture of the goal, right? Is it a state, right? So what does it mean, a Jewish state? Is it, right, similar? I mean, it's a little like, I'm going to be flippant, right? But like, it's kind of like the food pantry, right? Is the Jewish state a state for Jews, or is it a state established by Jews for, right, like for the world, right? What is the relationship? And for those of us who are not Israeli citizens who are voting in an Israeli democracy, then our relationship to the Jewish state as non-citizens but Jews of the world. And then you have also an Israel that is a political entity that has relationships with other countries as a political entity, right? Israel's going to make treaties with, you know, Brazil, or with, right, like whatever, right? There's kind of international relations that just come from the fact that it's not an idealistic image in our minds, right? It actually exists in the world and has to interact in the world. And so I think within the context of Zionism, I think this question really pervades. And I'll say before I then kind of like give it over, I'll actually just like lay out on the table, I think, my agenda within this, which is, can we actually have multiple voices within this, right? Like, what are the ways in which this conversation of this tension and the multiple ways that people can see can actually all be legitimate iterations of Zionism, that I think we've actually, I feel, largely within broader kind of institutions of Judaism have felt very stifled, right? Like, to be able to sort of say that we want a state that is Jewish for the world, or we want a state that is Jewish for Jews, is actually a real conversation that we can have, and none of those are illegitimate, right? We don't have to kind of kick people out for making one of those choices.
That was very wise. Beautiful. Can I just add, since we didn't have a chance to begin our session as we did the last time, remembering Rabbi Joe Rosenblum, I wanted to mention that this week, of course, we lost Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who was my teacher. And Rav Steinsaltz, I remember having a conversation with him in one of we had yechidus, which meant we had special time, private time together on a regular basis. And I once asked him this question about universalism and particularism, and he said, just have to remember, it's like a tennis pro. And I said, Rav Steinsaltz is going to talk to me about a tennis pro? Like, what does he know about it? But of course, he knew so much about so many things, a very broad person. But he said the state of Israel is your home court. Every tennis pro who goes out and goes on the circuit needs to have a home court. It's the place where you cultivate your game. And so on some level, the experiment, right, called the state of Israel, is us playing out these questions. How are we going to be an Or Goyim? How are we going to be a light unto the nations of the world? We're going to do it first and foremost by trying to create a society in which we can allow this to happen, these multiplicities of possibilities. With all the arguing and the tension and all the things that happen within that reality, it is an argument for the sake of heaven in the final analysis, because we're trying to lift up, I think one of Maharat Rory's favorite terms, to lift up the notion, right, that there can be multiple ways in which to do this, but the end game is the same: an elevated living, a holy living, a sanctified living, a living that's beyond the mundane, beyond getting up in the morning and making the donuts and that kind of terrible drudgery of life. Judaism allows for us to live in that kind of way. And if we can demonstrate that within our own societies, be they diaspora, be they in the state of Israel, then I think we have something compelling to say to the world.
And I just, I think Rabbi Steinsaltz also is just a perfect model of somebody who made Talmud accessible to all people in what was, I mean, I don't know the particular perspective, but I'm sure was a fairly controversial move. Not everybody thinks that anyone should be able to, right? I mean, he not only translated, but really made it readable and in context. And so what did it mean to sort of give to the world our internal dialogue and open ourselves up to that?
It's beautiful, and I appreciate you bringing Rabbi Steinsaltz Zichar Tzadik Livracha to the forefront, Carney, and Roy, for your words. But I want to go back also to this question that we're avoiding, actually, about Israel and Zionism. And, is it enough for us to rationalize and convince ourselves of this particularistic mission, albeit for this lofty, great goal of Or Lagoyim and Litaken et Haolam, to perfect the world? Is it enough for us to therefore excuse Israel on the ground in our day for its particularistic failings, for its emphasis, for its leadership's focus only on the Jewish particularistic mission? And is it okay? Is it acceptable for us to say, yes, but we have to take care of this mission in order for us to do our great theoretical work? Or do we need to, and this is the question I think all four of us, and we know others are asking us every day. Yes, they're asking why be Jewish? That's the secular American challenge that we all face. But many people are asking, why should I support this particular manifestation of the Jewish nation, the Jewish state? How can I support it even if there's this theoretical universal mission hiding behind the particular? If the particular is all the day-to-day policies and life of the nation of Israel focus on them, how can I support that? That's the question. And I feel like we either are afraid to face it or we're avoiding it.
I'm happy to go at it because I actually think you're raising a wonderful question. And I would say that just because something is imperfect doesn't obviate the responsibility to make it better. And I think we all remember, maybe not in our own consciousness, a world prior to the state of Israel. But I would say that we were much impoverished as a people, many existentially, but beyond that even, right? And the greatness of the formation of the state of Israel is all that has come from the state of Israel, with all of the tsuras and all of the challenges. All right, it's still an experiment, I would say, that has worked. And by the way, the fact that we can sit here in this relative comfort of the diaspora and have this conversation means it's worked. Meaning we can have this conversation, and when we're there, we can contribute, and we can shout, and we can yell, and we can disagree, and we can vote, and we can have protests, right? All of this, I think, is part of the great experiment. So I don't want to dismiss your question, because I know it's a very deep question. You mean it with every fiber of your being, and getting to know you around these issues. You come at this with such a deep and profound sense of the moral and the ethical. I don't want to dismiss it, because I'm with you there. I just want to say, thank God, again, just say thank God for living in a postmodern America, living in a time and a place where we can have the discussion and the debate and be part of the process of forging what the state of Israel will look like for our children, our grandchildren's generation, is the greatest blessing that I can imagine. And I still remember sitting, as a child, I grew up in a shul with many Holocaust survivors. Reb Shlomo Karlebach, of blessed memory, used to say, if you have really deep questions and you don't know the answers, find a person with a number on their arm and talk to them. And I remember in our shul growing up, we had those people who still had those numbers, and trying to kind of cuddle up next to them and cozy up next to them and listen to them daven and listen to them talk and hear the things they were thinking about or talking about when they were willing to talk about them. I hate to throw the Holocaust into this conversation, but I really feel as if the lachrymose reality of parts of Jewish history weigh heavy, at least on me, they weigh heavy. And so I want to thank God for the opportunity to have this discussion in this debate in an open way. It does not absolve us of the responsibility to move this process forward and to address the moral failings that we all see. I think everybody on this panel sees, and working actively to make things better within the state of Israel as well as in our own community.
I'm struck by all of this framing and by how much of it I think has to do with our relationship, and the R here is sort of particularly North American Jews, but maybe Jews in a post-Holocaust era, our discomfort with power, and whether that means, right, like a discomfort in taking responsibility and acknowledging the power we have. Right, just think about, right, you start talking about Jews in America who are the leaders of industry and banking and the press and in government and the judiciary, right? Like, and all, I guarantee you, of the 130 people watching right now participating, at least half of us just like got the grin crawls that it sounds a little anti-Semitic, right? We're uncomfortable for some really obvious reasons, I think, with Jewish power, except of course when we're glorifying in it, right? IDF Day at Jewish camps and so on and so forth. Something I used to actively love and participate in and now feel kind of uncomfortable about. But I don't know, for me, Jim, I can't separate this out from the other question of why be Jewish, because and Galia was talking about this in the chat too, saying, she doesn't see Judaism as a choice. I do, right? I think we look out objectively in America and we see people every day opting to let go of Jewish identity.
I really want to agree with you on that. I think that's really a very important piece. Very important piece.
For me personally, Judaism is not a choice. Like, I don't feel like I opted into being Jewish or feeling Jewish or acting Jewish. And I don't feel like, for me personally, I can opt out. And so the same for me is true of my relationship with the state of Israel. Like, it doesn't matter how Israel behaves or doesn't. As a Jew who doesn't feel the ability to opt out of that, I also don't feel like I can opt out of my ethical responsibility there. My obligation, right? It's part of my sphere of influence and being influenced and obligation. And I don't feel like I can opt out of those responsibilities. It's not quite the same, but any more than I can opt out of being a Missourian or an American.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I think that's a wonderful framing. I really think it's an important addition to this conversation. I'd be interested to hear how others feel. Right? Do we feel that if at some point we don't like what we see, do we start to move into a camp of being anti-Israel? Do we ever take that leap? Maybe that kind of is a segue or a little bit of a Vorschweitz, right? A little taste of maybe what we're going to talk about in our next session on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But I would never make that choice. With all of the challenges, I wouldn't want to be in a position where I would say that the enterprise called the State of Israel is not worth pursuing and supporting and advocating on behalf of.
Look, that's why I was a part of Breaking the Silence, because to me that feels like the obligation of leaning in, right? Like, we are obligated to Israel, and that's a part of it. And I understand for many folks that feels anti-Israel, but for me it feels quite the opposite.
I mean, that's where I wanted to also jump in, because I agree strongly with what you just said, Carney, and I don't even think of it as a choice to say that I would ever opt out. Like, I'm not in or out, like I am, and I feel that really deeply. And I do also know that there are people who have told me that I am anti-Zionist, right? And that's why, like, I appreciate so much the question that you raised, Jim. And I think we all might have our own answers for it, but I'm actually not interested personally. I mean, we can continue with the conversation, but I'm less interested in sort of, I think our answers could potentially kind of inform people, but I don't need everyone to agree with my answer, right? What I want is, I want a bigger tent. Like, I want room for the people in our community to ask those questions. Like, I don't want that question to be the reason why people get shut down. Like, the number of people who I talk to who feel like they can't raise that question in our community spaces. I mean, I say that in St. Louis, but I say that more widely. Or part of the reason of actually bringing this, and I think this is the benefit of people kind of eavesdropping, right? We've been having these conversations. I mean, I think like leadership has it, but people haven't heard us say it. And so the impression is people feel like it's not a safe question to ask. So I know what my answer is, and I feel really comfortable with it. I don't need my answer to be your answer. And I, again, I don't want to shut down the ability, but what I want to be able to say is that, right, that asking the question does not mean, right, that we have voices who want to say that by asking that question, you have inherently opted out, or by saying, did Israel do something wrong? Or I don't like this or whatever it might be, puts you on the outskirts. And that, I think, becomes a huge, it's a dearth for our Jewish community, right? There's not one way that we answer this question, right? Like, many of us, and again, I'm sort of silly, but I actually think the food pantry becomes a great model for this, right? Lots of us support the food pantry, and we can actually all support the food pantry for totally different reasons and be thrilled that the food pantry is there for totally different reasons, but are deeply invested in the enterprise. And we don't need to have meetings to make sure that everybody understands exactly the mission of the food pantry, right? Like, that what does it mean? Because I do believe, and then I think, Jim, you want to jump in, so I want to be respectful of that. But right, but I believe, like, I've talked to people who classify themselves now as anti-Zionist, who I don't actually think would have otherwise. I think that they are anti a definition of Zionism that our Jewish community has created, but are actually deeply in line with some of the earliest Zionist debates or early Zionist thinkers that we have, and have been forced to sort of see themselves, right, but are actually, I would say, like, deeply in a Zionist camp that we have made too narrow for them.
Thank you for saying that, Rory. As one of those who often is labeled, as you described yourself as well, as potentially anti-Zionist for saying things that are our truths. And I also will simply feel the need to say to us and remind us, it is possible for many people to choose not to be Jewish in this day and age. Even though, Daniel, you say you can't imagine yourself, I can't either. I can't imagine myself choosing not to be Jewish, but I could choose not to be Jewish. And I can't imagine myself, Carney, as you described, and Daniel also, and all of us. I do feel that I am in 100% with Israel for the long run. I can't imagine turning my back on Israel, although people often accuse me of that because I am critical and demanding and have high expectations. But I think we have to honor the fact that many of the people, maybe not the ones listening, because I don't know the ideas of the people on this webinar today, but many of the people in our communities and in our society are saying, forget it. I'm not interested. I don't feel connected to Israel. And I'm with you, Rory. We need to broaden the definition of Zionist. We need to but we also have to be, it's not good enough just to say, well, this is as good as it's going to get right now. Just stick with it. Maybe someday it'll get better. It's not good enough to say that. We have to demand, and I don't buy that because we're here in the United States, we don't get a voice or a vote, because we haven't gone and fought in the army, or because we don't, we haven't made Aliyah. I don't buy that. This is part of our universal Jewish project. And I think we're not being broad-minded enough in recognizing that. I love that we're doing this conversation. That's why we're doing it. But we have to remember that there are many people out there who could care less. And
I also think, to add, Rabbi Jim, that younger folks in particular, I don't know what your experience is. My experience is that the people who are talking to me about leaving, about exempting themselves from, casting themselves by choice out of the Jewish world, happen to be younger folks who cannot live with this tension between trying to live in a way that feels to them Jewish and the ways in which we talk often about what happens within the state of Israel. So I think it's, at least from our experience, it happens to be the younger folks. By the way, I just wanted to add that after having spent time in Bali, you said I wouldn't want to be anything but Jewish. I would really actually like to be a Balinese Hindu, at least for a week. Because, I mean, they get up in the morning and they daven, they go to bed at night, they daven, they're offering. I mean, it's really a great way of life. So if I could be a little bit of Yetzer Hara to be a Balinese Hindu. Rory, this was your session.
No, I didn't know if anyone else wanted to jump in with that. I mean, I think all of this. I mean, I don't think that this is anything that we're going to resolve here, but I think what we're really trying to do is start this conversation. And I think to really model, because I do think that in many ways the conversation is set by the community, right? And I think this was also part of, we were asked this last time. People were saying, okay, we love this conversation. How can we do it more? And I think I pushed then, and I want to really push now, right? This is an enterprise of all of us. And I want to say, I mean, I think that there are people in our community who are deeply invested in limiting this definition because right, and this is true, by the way, Eric, across the board, right? There are people who want to limit their definition of who gets to be Jewish. There's people who want to limit their definition of what it means to be Jewish. There's people who want to limit the definition of Zionism because it's far easier. It's far easier to limit the definition. I remember one time being with it was actually a Christian scholar, but someone was talking about extremists in our religious traditions, and I don't even remember now exactly what it was, but we were talking also, it was particularly soon after 9/11 and things like that. And somebody said, like, those are not real Christians. And she just said, it's really easy to just carve out a definition in which people don't fit in, and then we don't have to deal with them, right? And that's what we can do, right? I don't have to deal with these hard questions if I can carve out, right? I don't need to think about, right? If I don't have a Judaism that allows you to be atheist, then I don't have to think about what does it mean to be Jewish and not believe in God, right? Or if I have a Judaism that only requires you to keep kosher, I don't need to, right? And the same is true also, right? If I have a Zionism that requires you to believe certain things about Israel, I don't need to grapple with what does it mean that I have people in my community who don't do that. But it was actually Daniel Hartman who I remember saying, he said, we all like to think that communities are made up of people who are alike, but the reality is most of the time we inherit communities, we don't build them. And we find ourselves then with a group of people who don't necessarily all mix together really easily. And it's actually up to us to then make the communities fit, right? It's not that we all just kind of fit naturally in. And
remember Kobe Oz? Did you guys study Kobe Oz when you were at Hartman? And Kobe Oz basically talking about the Jewish people. It's like one big shul, like our synagogues. Like, can you imagine a monolith talking about our synagogues in any kind of monolithic way? To say all the people of name the synagogue feel this way. That would be ludicrous. But we wouldn't say to those people, you don't have a right to be here. You don't have a right to express your opinion, right? As long as you're doing it respectfully, as long as you do it with a sense that there's something here that binds us to one another, then you're part of the conversation. So I always remember that with Kobe Oz having that kind of notion of, like, the state of Israel is one big shul. And if we think about it that way, at least for me, it frames it.
And that, I mean, I think that's a great point of it. And I think that's actually been true. I think we've managed to build a Jewish community that has incorporated, right? Like we have a definition of Judaism that has a wide spectrum of belief in God, has a wide spectrum in terms of religious practice, in terms of self-identity, in terms of conversion process or non-conversion, whatever it is, right? We have been able to broaden this conversation. And I'm deeply invested in, can we also broaden this conversation in a similar way around Zionism, right? What does it mean to say that we have people who are in our Jewish community who are invested in the Zionist project, right? And I'm using that in a very broad sense, right? But right, right, I think for all of us who do this work, right, the people that we've lost are the people who are not actually in the conversation, right? The people who are angry or who are grappling or who are fighting back, those are the people who are invested in the project. And so how do we engage in a conversation? And I don't think, I mean, look, Judaism has not had to widen itself so far as to say that everybody is suddenly defined as Jewish, right? We have parameters. I don't at all mean that we get rid of the parameters. But again, right, I think that there are people in our community who love Israel, who are wrestling with Israel, who feel deeply conflicted about Israel, and who don't feel like they have a space at our table. And my hope, and the hope that I want to bring for all of us as we're winding down here at the end of our time, is that we can create that space to say, because I believe our Judaism is rich enough to hold them too. Right? I think our community is rich enough. And frankly, I think Israel and Zionism is strong enough to hold them. Right? I understand there's a discomfort. I think in the earliest years, there was this feeling like Israel could disappear, right? Or it felt really vulnerable. I think Israel's strong enough. Israel is strong enough for us to question and to grapple with, and to even push back, right? I don't like, Israel's strong enough to handle it. And I think our Jewish community is strong enough to handle it. And I think our Jewish community is not strong enough to handle not having our Jewish community in it and in this conversation.
Rory, I'm struck that our words don't even quite fit our moment too, right? Like, what does it mean to be a Zionist today? That I believe that in 1948 people should go and create the state of Israel? Like, I don't live in 1948. The state of Israel exists. I'm not a part of a political movement working to create a Jewish state. I'm fortunate to have been born into a world where like this is our reality. And so in a very real sense, I think we are all living in a post-Zionist world, and yet we are still so stuck on these old lenses and these old words too.
My fear
problem.
is that if we don't work on it, we'll live in a post-Zionist world, and not by choice. We will implode, and that will be in many, many ways to the detriment of the Jewish community worldwide.
So I want to hold on, because we just used that word Zionist in a really different way, Carney. And we meant something very different by it.
So
Go ahead, go.
I'm gonna pause here and put in a pin and a plug, because I think this is actually a great teaser. Because next week, Rabbi Carney Rose is going to be leading us in a conversation about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and maybe part of the question of what is anti-Zionism is a question of what is Zionism, right? And when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism, and when do we have criticism of Israel? So we're gonna just make that a teaser and pick up on that next week, because I know people have to go, and I'm grateful for all the time that people have given us. So let me just say with that, a deep thank you to the three of you for wrestling with these questions and giving me some new insights in how I think about all of this, and to all of the people who have been listening or who are listening later. We're really grateful, and I'm going to say really grateful both for joining us for this conversation, but also for supporting us in a community, right? Because this is also, if we didn't have a community that allowed for these conversations, it makes it much harder for all of us to have our jobs where we can also really wrestle and be vulnerable in this way. So I'm deeply grateful to the community, and for all of you for joining. And next week, same time, same place, 1 p.m. Central Time on Tuesday, to be continued.